I suppose I should start off by explaining what the title means by other games of 2020. Well, I played a lot of games in 2020. Normally when making my Game of the Year video, I operate under the rule of, if I played it for the first time in that year, it's fair game, because a lot of the time I don't have 10 games released in a given year that I feel like talking about. Well, that wasn't the case this past year. I filled out a whole list of 2020 releases. But I still want to talk about the games that I played in 2020 but didn't release that year. Thankfully, I played enough of those to have 10 worth talking about. Now that we have that little caveat out of the way, let's get started. For the first 5 or so minutes that I was playing this game, I kept pushing the blocks out instead of towards me. I felt like a moron when I realized my mistake. I always wanted to play Catherine back when it was on the PS3, but I never got to it. Thankfully, back in 2019, it was released as Catherine Full Body for the PS4. Catherine is a puzzle platformer about Vincent, a man who is in a seemingly passionless relationship with his girlfriend, Catherine. After a wild night at the bar, Vincent meets Catherine and ends up taking her home and sleeping with her. From then on, Vincent is plagued by these very surreal nightmares, which is where the gameplay happens as he climbs up these wacky puzzle towers alongside a bunch of sheep people. There's not a whole lot to say about the gameplay. You push around the blocks and they get more intricate as time goes on. There are helpful power-ups sprinkled throughout the level. It was a fair challenge and plenty of fun. However, the reason I was always drawn to Catherine was due to the story and vibe it has. Honestly, the fact that it's an Atlus game is written all over it. Vincent's wacky dating adventure seems like it would be right at home as a side story in a Persona game. Full Body also made a few additions, such as Rin, the new character, complete with their own branch of the story, as well as a few extra scenes. I enjoyed the flashback scenes to how Vincent and Catherine got together. In the original version, it seemed like the relationship just consisted of Catherine browbeating Vincent, but these additional scenes made it believable that there was something more to the relationship at some point. All in all, I'm happy to finally be able to cross the game off the list after so many years.
Well, Cuphead and his pal Mugman, they like to roll the dice.
Cuphead was one of the only games to make me bummed that I didn't own an Xbox when it came out. It's a good thing it came to Switch then, huh? It's funny though, Cuphead is known for being rather difficult, but I can't help but feel like I wasn't ever overwhelmed by it. Don't get me wrong, I died a lot, but the lion's share of the time I spent with the game was spent playing it while chatting with people. Anytime I gave the game my full attention, it wouldn't take me any more than half an hour or so to defeat a boss. I guess that just means I wasn't getting frustrated because of the low investment. The bosses were all pretty cool. There's 19 bosses and I only really disliked 2 of them. The best thing this game has going for it is the presentation. It really captures the old school cartoon vibe it's going for, and the unbelievably expressive visuals give each boss a sense of identity. Like I said, there's 19 of them and none of them feel too samey from a visual standpoint, and the music pairs with the old-timey visuals perfectly. Another big strength was the fact that because it's just a boss rush, it's really easy to pick up and play. It was my go-to thing when I needed to kill some time in between big releases like the Resident Evil 3 and Final Fantasy VII remakes. My Friend Pedro is one of those games that operates by the rule of cool. Its goal is to look and feel as cool as possible while playing, and just about nothing else. I'd say it accomplishes that goal pretty handily. It functions like a 2D side-scrolling shoot-'em-up game. You want to kill everyone in sight, but you also want to look as snazzy as possible while you do it, so that you can maintain your multiplier and rake in the praise from your amusing banana friend. The game's level of variety is great. New elements are constantly being introduced. Panels that ricochet bullets, ropes to swing from, and skateboards to ride on all make for some really impressive tools to use during your violent rampage. And this all pairs with the solid, ever-expanding arsenal of guns and the excellent core bullet time mechanic to make for a great adrenaline-fueled romp. I guess the one thing against it is that the second half isn't paced out nearly as well as the first. The level design doesn't flow together as nicely to me, and considering the game is only like 5 hours long, being able to point to a part that isn't as good kinda takes a bit of the shine off. But honestly, as a first game from developer Dead Toast, it is still pretty impressive, and I am certainly interested to see what they do next. Could you imagine a game like this, but with the Deadpool license? Oh Rats! A Plague Tale: Innocence is a narrative-driven third-person adventure game taking place in medieval France during the 100 Years' War. You assume control of Amicia de Rune, who is on the run with her brother Hugo from the Inquisition after the Inquisition showed up and wrecked her family's estate and killed her parents. After that fiasco, Amicia and her brother Hugo have to evade the Inquisition, who want to capture Hugo for reasons explained later, the English army, who are invading because of that pesky 100 Years' War, and a massive horde of rats because of that pesky plague. This game feels like it was pretty heavily inspired by The Last of Us. There's a very emotionally intense story to carry you through the gameplay that takes a backseat to the narrative. That's not to say the gameplay is necessarily bad. It's mostly stealth and puzzle based, which makes sense because the leading duo is comprised of 2 children. The puzzles are solid though, and the game builds upon them with more elements added as the game goes on. Such elements include the alchemy-based projectiles that Amicia can hurl with her sling. This includes lighting torches from a distance to push away any rats that may be around, putting fires out so that the rats can eat enemy soldiers, or throwing some sort of acid at the soldiers to make them take off their helmets and expose themselves to a well-placed rock between the eyes. The combat in the game is sparse. Enemies die in one hit if you sling them in the head, but you also die in one hit if they spot you, so even the more combative encounters are just really puzzles about finding the right sequence to do things in. There are also a couple of boss fights, but those feel like they're at odds with the rest of the gameplay. Not that the encounters were bad, they were just kind of clumsy. Still, the gameplay is good enough to get you from beat to beat in the story, which is really what I was here for anyway. A heartfelt story about 2 siblings overcoming the struggles thrust upon them. It's certainly one of those play it for the experience type of games. The year is 1807. 5 years ago, a ship called the Obra Dinn set sail with about 60 people aboard, but it never came back. Well, until now, the game's got a game. You assume control of an insurance inspector. Your goal is to figure out what happened. You receive a list of all 60-odd people, and you have to determine their fate. The game has a very cool, historical fiction, lost colony of Roanoke kind of vibe to it. Upon looking around the ship for a second, it's easy to see that most of the crew is dead. After you sort out that wrinkle, you just have to figure out how they died and who or what did it. Now that would be pretty hard to pull off with only a handful of 5-year-old skeletons to work with, but thankfully the crew doctor, one of the survivors, mailed our upstanding inspector a handy magical pocket watch that returns the player to the scene of the death of whichever body player happens to be standing over. This even applies to dead bodies and flashbacks, so it does not take long to get all Inception with the concept. The fates of the crew get confirmed for you in groups of 3, which is nice because it keeps you from being totally wrong because of one detail that's incorrect and thus unraveling your whole perception of what happens. But it also keeps you from being able to just blindly guess away at the fates of the crew. As a logic puzzle, Return of the Obra Dinn is perhaps the best mystery game I've ever played. I felt pretty clever when I started clicking together background details or using context clues to successfully aid my deductions. However, while the story is cool and the setup is interesting, it feels like it was held back a touch. Discovering what happens feels like it was more interesting than what actually went down. That's not to say the game didn't have some really cool gasp moments, but I feel like I was missing that final wham moment that clicked everything into place as far as the story went, which is especially disappointing because the game teases a mysterious missing chapter. Still, the actual puzzle solving was satisfying on another level from other mystery games, and I'd be interested to see another stab at a mystery game in the vein of this one. I've always wanted to play one of the Paper Mario games. Bug Fables takes clear inspiration from Paper Mario and Thousand Year Door. It has the same kind of storybook visuals and the reaction commands during combat. Bug Fables manages to be charming in its own right though. Rather than go from chapter to chapter with new party members, the 3 characters you have at the beginning are who you have the whole game. This makes for a pretty balanced party in the combat. I found that most of the time, 2 of them were a winning combo on a particular enemy encounter, and the other one would oftentimes play support. It varied from encounter to encounter though, so it wasn't always Kabu and Leaf smacking people around while V heals. The main trio also plays off of each other in the story really well. Kabu the Beetle is this bright-eyed do-gooder who's always willing to help because it's the right thing to do. V the Bee is a greedy adventurer who balances out Kabu's good nature by demanding that they always get paid, but she can still be rather good-natured when it actually matters. And Leaf the Moth is an amnesiac with special freezing powers, and he's also delightfully snarky. Watching Team Snakemouth, as they come to be called, get up to hijinks made me look forward to whatever the story was going to do next. The story wasn't anything too complicated, a typical fairy tale sort of adventure, except where the characters were all bugs. That's not a bad thing in this case, though. Not every plot needs 6 jaw-dropping revelations for the climax. The simple story made it easier to appreciate the details of the charming world. Each kingdom has their own unique cultures that are fun to become acquainted with as you spend your time there. I especially enjoyed the Golden Settlements Festival. I'm a sucker for festivals. So while I may have yet to play a Paper Mario game, I'm more than happy to play this love letter to them. If a cozy RPG sounds like a good time to you, I recommend giving this one a shot. Who knows, you may like it more than the things that inspired it. I'm going to open this segment with a question. Why don't more games include telekinesis as a power you can use? This game reminded me that it's a crazy fun power-up, and off the top of my head I can only think of a couple of other games that use it. Seriously, few things are as fun to me as stopping a missile or what have you, seconds before it hits me and throwing it back at my foe, or using one of the fallen enemies to beat up the rest of my opposition. The other power-ups in this game are great as well. You get the ability to float, a fancy dodge, and a shield. They're all cool moves that flow nicely together. The combat overall feels like it's set apart from the typical third-person shooter type of game. The powers obviously contribute to that, but the fact that you can modify your gun to be almost anything you want it to be is also really cool. And the shooting mechanics feel better than the typical third-person, hide behind cover and then pop up to take pot shots kind of deal. Control is about Jessie Faden infiltrating the Bureau of Control in order to find her brother Dylan. What's the Bureau of Control? A government agency that handles supernatural hijinks. Shortly after Jessie finds her way into the building, she sees the director of the Bureau shoot himself. She then picks up his gun and inherits the role of director. And this premise reminds me of Tim Allen's The Santa Claus. The setting of the game is the Oldest House, this supernatural, ever-changing building. It makes for the perfect backdrop to all of the strange happenings in the game, and it has this cool built-in excuse for how one building can be so varied. Character-wise, the two standouts are Jessie and Dr. Darling. Jessie is a good lead character. We get to hear her snarky inner monologue in most conversations before she thinks better of what she was gonna say and picks the more polite response. She also strikes the right balance of being curious and perplexed by the craziness going on around her, while still managing to focus on the goal of finding her brother. Dr. Casper is fun because his videos are what explain all of the weird phenomena that happen at the Oldest House. His delivery lands somewhere between matter of fact and amused, and it's always really fun to see him pop up. This game also has one of the more interesting lore logs that I've seen in a while. One of the first things you get is this piece of paper that lists off banned items. Such items include smartphones or anything else with smart in the name, anything with iconography on it, and number 2 pencils. I was left wanting to know why these items were banned. Control was a fun adventure with a cool setting that left me craving more. Thankfully, it was left open-ended enough that I could see a sequel coming along to remedy that craving. Katana Zero was a welcome surprise when I played it. I think the easiest way to explain it is it's like a marriage of Hotline Miami and Ninja Gaiden. It has a 2D side-scrolling perspective, but the goal of each screen is to kill everyone in the room, usually with a solid amount of difficulty. Much like Hotline Miami, slaughtering the scores of criminals in Katana Zero's seedy cyberpunk underbelly was more akin to solving a puzzle rather than running in guns blazing. Katana Zero's defining mechanic is the player character's precognition ability. This lets you slow down time for a couple of easy kills, or widen the window for spiffy bullet deflections. The gameplay was already satisfying enough to carry me through the whole way, but what really sticks with me about this game after playing it is the world that it crafted and the story it told. I compared it to Hotline Miami earlier, and the tone of the game is pretty similar, but it's more like what the story of those games would have been if they had toned down the drug trip vibes enough to tell you a story that was actually engaging. You assume the role of an unnamed amnesiac swordsman, killing people with ties to the criminal underworld. He gets these missions from a dossier given to him by his psychologist. Conflict of interest? Whatever do you mean? From there, the story takes several interesting turns. Seedy underworld drug deals, government conspiracies, and strange flashback dreams are all interwoven into a wonderful cyberpunk crime drama. And hey, unlike a certain AAA outing in a setting like this, Katana Zero is actually functional.
They can break you, but not your promise. Even death won't keep you apart. Through his darkness you will find him. In your sword still beats a heart.
I'm pretty sure that Senua's Sacrifice is the last holdout on my list of great games from 2017 that I didn't get to yet. The setup for Senua's Sacrifice is the game's protagonist, Senua, is traveling to the Norse underworld to make a deal with the goddess of death to free her dead lover's soul. I'm going to get the gameplay out of the way because it's not really anything special on the mechanic level, but it is a really great vehicle for the game to deliver its story. Most of the gameplay can be boiled down into 3 different categories: quiet walking sections, puzzle gates where you have to find the Norse runes hidden in the environment, and then the combative sections. The combat isn't anything too complicated. You've got the standard light and heavy attacks, plus a kick that is really good for interrupting incoming enemy attacks. You also get a parry that's really satisfying to pull off. I wouldn't say that the game is necessarily super difficult, but it was just as effective as it needed to be. I didn't die at all aside from a couple of scripted losses in the game, but it seemed like at the end of every encounter I was barely limping away, which is, in my opinion, the perfect balance. I don't want to go into explicit plot details beyond the setup of the game, but I will talk about what the game does that makes the story so good. The way that they contextualize Senua's struggle is masterful. Senua has some sort of psychosis. I'm not really certain of what specifically, and I'd rather not be presumptive about this sort of thing, but she's constantly hearing voices in her head or seeing things that aren't happening. It's enough to make her ability to just push forward really hard at times. Every time she does something, she's met with a lot of chatter that's second-guessing her, or alternate possibilities, and it just makes any victory that Senua can get really satisfying. I remember specifically there were a few combat encounters that on top of hearing the voices chatter about how she was going to die, there was also narration saying that Senua's quest was pointless. I had taken a decent amount of damage at that point, and Senua was limping around while being surrounded by like 4 monsters. I got a perfect parry, followed by another, and then I managed to kill one of them. It wasn't even the eventual victory in the combat encounter that was so satisfying. It was just surviving in spite of everything that was trying to grind this poor lady down. It's that kind of satisfaction from the smaller victories that made me want to keep going and see the game through to the end. It seems like it was only a matter of time before one of these visual novel mysteries took the top spot on one of these lists. Now here comes the problem. Talking about this game beyond, hey, it's a really cool mystery, is hard. I said earlier that Obra Dinn was probably the best logical puzzle I've ever played as far as mystery games go. Well, AI the Somnium Files is also a very rock-solid mystery in its own right, and it has all of the other things you need to make it more interesting. A great cast, a wonderful story, and loads of suspense. I'm going to be pretty light on the details from here on out, so if it sounds at all fascinating to you, go check this game out. Alright, so you assume control of Kaname Date, a special investigator for a secret division of the police. His division uses a fancy machine to jump into people's subconscious and pull info from their dreams to solve mysteries. This is where a majority of the gameplay happens. You solve puzzles in suspects' dreams. Sound cool yet? Well, the game starts off with a murder, and the victim has an eye missing, and that is all I'm going to tell you as far as the explicit details go. From then on, the story spirals and casts this massive web. The game lived rent-free in my head the whole time I was playing it, in many instances after I finished it. I played it over the span of about 2 weeks, and oh boy, theorizing about what was going to happen made time pass by at work really quickly for those couple of weeks. The game is so good at setting up its points of intrigue and then creating and curating a vibe to go with it. I enjoyed most of the characters, with maybe a couple of exceptions. Date is a great protagonist, oftentimes seeming a bit bumbling, but actually really good at what he's doing when it counts, as well as having his own level of intrigue when it comes to the story. Aiba, his partner, has a great dynamic with him. The whole cast has great interactions with each other. It really is a testament to the writing that the characters were fun to be around, even when the threat of immediate death wasn't present. The music also contributes to the neo-noir vibe in spades. From character themes to recurring songs to just one-time tracks, they're all great at setting the mood. This is apparent from the moment the game starts. The title screen greets you with an amazing piece. The song starts off with a very ethereal, dreamlike vocalization, giving the feeling of a hazy memory that can't quite be placed. The vocalization gives way to a tragic-sounding piano part, and then the two parts come together as if the truth of the tragic events are being pieced together in the song. Oh wow, this is what happens when I can't chat spoilers about the game that's 85% story. I start analyzing the music. Anyway, I guess if I could say one final parting regard, it's that the intro segment joked about me not wanting to pick between this game and Hades, and that is 100% true. I won't choose, and you can't make me. I liked this game so much that I decided to make an extra video for it to be the top of.